And sometimes, right, sometimes you're in a situation where the amount wrong somebody isn't worth destroying them for, right? It's like, okay, let them think that. Sometimes you're in that situation where it's not worth a battle. But most of the time, if someone's wrong about something, then you could gently tell them, explain to them why they're wrong. And if they're like, oh, I can't hear this, it's like, okay, no, but this is good for you. You should at least hear it, even if you don't change your behavior. Like, listen, right? So I think the main difference is people prioritizing feelings over being right. It's like, no, feelings, your lived experience and your feelings is what matters most, when there is really an objective reality that at least should be heard.
Adam Soos here for Rebel News, and I am very excited to welcome my guest, Mikhaila Peterson, to join me today for a conversation. She is a CEO and international speaker and the host of the Michaela Peterson podcast. She garnered international fame for her meat-only diet, which she used to overcome a significant history of health problems. All of that we'll get to in our conversation. She also discusses issues and topics and engages in dialogue on a level that much of society could learn to benefit from on the Michaela Peterson podcast. Hey, Mikhaila, very happy to have you join me. Folks out there very likely familiar with some of your exceptional work. I wanted to, before we get into some interesting topics, certainly get into a little bit about your history. You're kind of known as that girl who eats meat, but many people don't know the history behind that, the reasoning behind that. I didn't know until quite recently, and I found that quite fascinating. So I think before we get into some of those topics, if we can give some people some of your sort of background and how you ventured into this world of meat.
Yes. Okay. Let's start with that. It wasn't because I wanted to be known as Meat Girl, as much fun as that is. But when I was 2, I started experiencing severe joint pain, and I was diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis when I was 7, and it was severe. It was in 37 joints, and in grade 2, I could barely walk until I was put on a number of medications that did work initially. And so that was the arthritis component, but then it got worse. In grade 6, I went on medication for major depressive disorder, so antidepressants, SSRIs. In grade 8, I started to get chronic fatigue, and that wasn't diagnosed until I was 21, and I was put on Adderall for idiopathic hypersomnia, otherwise known as chronic fatigue. I had my hip and ankle replaced when I was 17 from the arthritis that wasn't kept in check by the immune suppressants that I had been injecting 2 times a week from the age of 8 on. And when I was 22, I started to get this rash, and I had kind of gotten used. You never get used to chronic pain or anything, but because I'd grown up with it and I hadn't known anything different, it was just, this is just my reality. But when I was 22 and I got this rash and it was on my body and then it was on my face, and I was like, okay, chronic fatigue is one thing, and major depressive disorder, which was the worst thing I think I suffered from, and arthritis. I've managed to wrap my head around that, but I can't deal with having a rash on my face. That's too far. So when I also think I got old enough to understand how uncomfortable I was, right? Because like I said, I was so young when I was sick that was just my baseline reality. And when I was about 22, I was like, you know what? This is bad. Like, I've had my hip and ankle replaced. My body isn't getting better. The medications aren't working. This could potentially kill me. And that's not a dramatic way of putting it. I have a number of second cousins with autoimmunity, and one of them died when she was 30 from a similar skin disorder as the one I had. So I was like, this isn't working for me. So I switched out of what I was doing and went to school for biomedical science and thought, I'm going to have to go into immunology, probably, or maybe microbiology to figure out what's wrong with me, because the medical system doesn't know. And I spent a couple of years reading every scientific paper I could about the medications I was on and how they worked on a cellular level. But long story short, I ended up looking at gluten as one of the agents causing my inflammation. And I did the genetics of my entire family to see if there was a genetic component, found out I have a celiac gene. So that's an autoimmune disorder where if you're exposed to gluten, your body freaks out and starts destroying its tissues, mainly in the gut. although celiac disease can manifest as this rash I had, this horrible rash. So I cut out gluten initially, and that was 2015, and I started feeling better over the summer a little bit better, but enough that I was like, okay, maybe there's something to diet. And in the fall, I went on a really limited paleo diet of like meat and greens, and I wasn't aware that there was keto or paleo or any of these diets at that point, but I figured, let's just remove any variable in my diet that could potentially be causing inflammation. And I thought, okay, people are allergic to nuts, people are allergic to wheat, people are allergic to dairy, eggs, people have sensitivities to nightshades, processed foods. So I just cut out everything, and I ended up with meat and greens, basically. And in that month, I put myself into remission from the arthritis. So the joint pain stopped. Prior to that, I had stopped taking the immune suppressant to monitor my flare-ups, because I figured you can't monitor your flare-ups if they're artificially being suppressed by medication. I was keeping extensive notes in like Google Sheets. So I was taking my symptoms 5 times a day of like skin, digestion, mood, fatigue. But I ended up on a paleo diet, and that really completely changed my life. And I completely lost faith in the medical system. So I went to my doctors and I was like, I'm reacting to foods. And they're like, well, no, you're not. I was like, no, I am, right? I lost 3 pant sizes, but hardly any weight. So I had a whole bunch of bloating I didn't know I had. And a few months after that, I stopped taking my antidepressants because my depression went away and my fatigue went away. So the arthritis went away first, and then the depression and fatigue lifted at about the same time. And I was like, this is insane. I've never experienced life like this without this heavy, like the depression felt like I was walking through tar. Everything was kind of gray. Everything was hard. I mean, look, people suffer from depression. It was the worst thing I've ever experienced. And it lifted, and I thought, okay, this is crazy. So the arthritis, the chronic fatigue, the depression, this was all associated with what I was eating. And that made me really angry because I'd already had my hip and ankle replaced, and you can't go back from that. So I stopped taking everything. And unfortunately, I didn't know this at that time, if you're on SSRIs or any psych medication for a very long time, and I was on a very high dose, and you stop taking it suddenly, you can put yourself into withdrawal. And I had heard about, I'd taken OxyContin when I had my hip and ankle replaced. So I'd experienced opiate withdrawal. People know that, right? You get like, nauseous, hot and cold. You can get this crawling sensation. It's very unpleasant. But I didn't know you could go into SSRI withdrawal. And I spent the next 2.5 years in SSRI withdrawal without knowing exactly what was going on. So all my psych symptoms came back, panic, this horrible sense of doom, like impending doom, something terrible was about to happen. And I ended up sensitive to light and sounds and touch and temperature. So it was like my nervous system just had, majorly sensitized. And yeah, well, it was like it had been numbed. It was like my body had been numbed, and I exposed it. And then it was exposed, which I don't think people understand exactly what happens when you're on psych meds for a long time and you suddenly stop taking them, but it's very unpleasant. So how I ended up on the all meat diet was I had been pretty much fine on a very, very limited paleo diet. And then I stopped taking all my medication, and my body sensitized, and I couldn't tolerate carbs anymore. And so about 1.5 years into the SSRI withdrawal, I kind of like kept limiting. I was like, this has got to be diet. What's going on? I need to go into remission again. How do I do that? And I just got rid of all the variables. I was like, I know I can eat steak. Steak doesn't make me feel bad. Let's just get rid of everything except steak. Do that for a month, and then start again and reintroduce foods. And I did that for a month, and I stopped crying in the morning from the depression or SSRI withdrawal, whatever it was at that point. And 6 weeks into it, the depression lifted. And 5 months into just eating meat, the lingering anxiety went away. And So naturally, I tried to reintroduce foods again. And I started simply, I did this in a scientific method, I thought anyway. It was like one variable, organic, let's try olives. Olives are a health food. And I tried introducing olives, and my autoimmune symptoms came back and the depression came back. And so I got rid of the olives again. And so there's been some controversy around this diet because it's all meat. I've been doing it since December 2017. My family's on it. And it's gained some attention in the media. A lot of chronically ill people have tried it because they've tried everything else, right? And you wouldn't really try an all meat diet unless you've tried everything else first. But that's kind of the background. So that turned me into, the meat girl person.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, and it's certainly incredible that so many people out there, you say that it's the last sort of result or the last sort of outcome. I know a number of people who have at least done keto or reduced carbs significantly and seen positive outcomes, myself included. But it's what I find so incredibly interesting. And I wanted this to sort of transition into this topic of cancel culture, whether it be medicinal or academic. You actually did a TED talk, and you're very clear right on your website. You say, I'm not a doctor. You yourself, you have a personal story. You went through hell. This helped you. You're letting people know what helped you. You made that very clear in your TED talk. You make that very clear everywhere you go. That TED talk was effectively not aired or uploaded, and your story was very much canceled. Is that right?
Yeah, I was really excited actually. In August, I was invited to a TEDx, and TEDx events are put on locally. So the person who was doing the TEDx wanted me to tell my story, but that doesn't mean TED stands behind that necessarily. So I just did, an 8-minute spiel about this is what happened to me. This is anecdotal. I did say I've seen this work for a lot of other people, and I ended it with, it would be really cool if the medical community could run some case studies, or any type of study just to look into it rather than being like, oh, that's a fringe quack diet. Like, no, objectively this happened to me. Objectively, it's happened to other people. The keto diet has been studied for almost 100 years for epilepsy. There is definitely something here. Maybe just look into it, right? And then TEDx, I was the only talk at that entire event that wasn't uploaded. And the event coordinator went back and forth with them for 5 months, being like, what exactly was wrong with it? What exactly was wrong with it? Because I did follow community guidelines. I said it was anecdotal, and they eventually ended with, you didn't follow community guidelines, we're not posting it. And I was like, well, I'll just blur out the TED and I'll post it. That was a mistake on their part.
Yeah, and it's shocking. We'll see. Often it comes down to who you are. We've often, one of our only strikes, we're very vigilant about following guidelines. If we have content that doesn't follow the guidelines, the video will cut off and we'll say, hey, go watch this on another platform.
Yeah.
The one strike we got was a clip that was a major news clip of a president who apparently can't be named on YouTube. So it was a news clip that every news outlet had put on their YouTube channels presently. We pulled it from one of those YouTube channels and we got a strike. So it very much comes down to who you are.
Yeah.
The community standards are so arbitrarily worded that they can basically enforce. And this is kind of what I wanted to get into. There seems generally and broadly to be a lack of dialogue within society. Your podcast, Joe Rogan Experience, lots of these other types of shows are beginning to have conversations with people who don't necessarily agree with each other. And people are attracted to that because broadly in society, those authentic conversations are fading away. They're being tossed by the wayside. It's either you adhere to the sort of spirit of the times, or you get out of the way and you're thrust to the margins. And it's kind of interesting because very much the liberal progressives were all about these stories from the margins. I think your story, your medical experience, is one of those very marginalized stories that is trying to have a voice because there's likely other people in the same situation. What do you make of the broad sort of breakdown of dialogue within society?
What do I make of it? It's hard to say. It's hard to say exactly what happened. I remember, and I was younger, but it wasn't like this when I was in high school. Like it was kind of like this, but it wasn't really like this. You could say things and people could disagree with you and you didn't end up on, in different states. What do I make of it? I don't know. And I don't know what direction it's heading in either. It's hard to say. Like in September, I moved out of Canada. So I moved from Toronto. I'm in Nashville now. And that was because I wasn't sure what was going to happen in the winter, right, with Trudeau. And we kind of saw what happened in the winter. So I'm glad I'm in Nashville. But I don't know. I'm a little bit more confident that maybe things will get better. You can tell me how you feel about it. And it might be just because I've been living in Nashville. But it kind of feels like maybe by the summertime, things will have gotten a little bit better. Although now we're in like World War III, so...
For me, I think very much this sort of end logic of this breakdown of dialogue within society has become cancel culture. So I think that's sort of the end logic of us not being able to have conversations. I know personally, my favorite conversations, some of my best friends are people I disagree with vehemently. And that's what's most interesting. If you're sitting around, it's great to commiserate with people you agree with. But at a certain point, you're like, well, what are we going to argue about? Most of my best friends, we argue to the point that people think we're fighting. And then we're like, okay, see you next week. So I think that those conversations are absolutely vital. To your point, though, the fact that certain voices, Joe Rogan, your dad, yourself, so many of these voices who are maybe a counterpoint to the prevailing cultural norms, are starting to become more popular. Mainstream media, legacy media being extremely well-funded continues to exist, but the fact is no one watches it. More people very often watch Rebel News than CBC. We're not getting millions of dollars from the government. We're getting views because people watch us. So I think to your point, maybe there is some positivity coming and there is a prevailing shift in the right direction of us being able to return to having respectful conversations. It's interesting. You mentioned that when you were younger, it wasn't like this. And I thought I'd just kind of ask if you've noticed this as well, but it seems now that this idea of conservatism or right wing is being branded to anyone who is willing to engage in ideas. Like there are people who wouldn't traditionally have been branded as right wing or conservative, who today, like people would probably automatically throw you in that category just because you're willing to have conversations and ask questions. Conversely, back in the day when we were younger, it seemed like it was the progressives who were the ones asking questions and stirring things up. Do you agree that there's been sort of a shift in that way?
I'd be really interested to see, like my dad's done a bunch of work on personality differences between conservatives and liberals. And I'd be really interested to see if that temperament has changed, because I agree. What it looks like to me is that conservatives are more willing to talk to liberals than liberals are willing to talk to conservatives. And even when I was in high school, I think, so that was like even around 2009, 2010, even around that period of time, I would have identified as a liberal. I always identified as a libertarian, but it would have been like a liberal libertarian, right? I was like, no, I want freedoms for everybody, right? I want less government involved in people's lives and freedom, right? And that's freedom of speech, freedom of religion, just freedom. And it looks like something's happened, and the people I would have branded as conservative are more looking like people on the left. Although then they're also more likely to, dye hair and wear less conservative clothes. So there's still that factor that's still kind of on the left. So I don't know exactly what's going on.
They're very much sort of upholding the status quo of society now, which is all these norms. So in the 90s, in the Full House world, I was extremely punk rock, mohawk, leopard print pants, the studded vest, the whole shebang. So I was that sort of counterpoint to the everyone has to be the same, and this is the normalized society we live in. Now it seems that sort of chaos that we're dancing on is the norm, and any sort of sameness is considered problematic.
I like that.
So okay. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. No. Okay. So maybe I was kind of similar. I don't think I had regular colored hair for a very long time. It was like blue, right? Tons of piercings. Like it wasn't, I didn't have a mohawk, but I wasn't like the conservative young person. And so what you're saying is maybe the the outliers became mainstream. And so the outliers now that's interesting. I like that. Yeah, I can get behind that.
And I think very often you can look at history. You look at, for example, when a new party comes into power, or a new don't want to get Marxist on us here, but a new class sort of comes into power. Very often they're like vehemently zealous in enforcing their staples. So I think very often that's why we get this. We're not going to listen to counterpoints. We're not going to talk about it. And that can prevail academia, that can prevail within medicine, and it can prevail within society at large. But I think one of the things that we see, like we talked about earlier, your story being muted, your sort of marginalization, very often what we're seeing is that society, they're sort of making tokens of groups. They're reducing everyone to a single identity. We're guilty of it too. I called you Meat Girl. But I think very much, I'm interested in the sort of plurality and the entire concept of a person, everything they're interested in. I think C.S. Lewis said there's no such thing as a boring person. So you look at the entirety of a person, and they're incredibly nuanced. But when you're talking about upholding a sort of new regime of progressivism with this newfound power, they want everyone reduced to a single talking point that can be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's a lot easier to attack one, a person if they just represent one thing, right? So that makes sense to me. That's what happened to my dad when he got famous with controversy. It was like, oh, you are a blank, right? Misogynist or something like that. It's easier. It takes less time. It's an easier sell too for the media. So I get it.
And then back to your story, like, very much what happens is people are reduced to sort of straw men. Their argument is whittled down to effectively nothing, and they're categorized as this one thing instead of attacked when we could learn from something. What is that sort of experience like? Like, I don't know if you were necessarily full on canceled. You probably haven't been attacked quite to the same degree your dad has, but there is still that sort of sentiment of your story doesn't matter, so be quiet and go away, isn't there?
Well, I don't know. I probably have a bit of a warped opinion about it. So in 2018, when I first started talking about diet, it was scarier because I didn't have a platform. So there were a number of news outlets that came out with, how crazy is this? BuzzFeed and like big ones. But BuzzFeed was big enough anyway. People theoretically read that. But that was scary for me. And part of the reason I started building an online presence was because I didn't want to be known as something that I wasn't. I was like, well, it's a lot less scary if you have an online platform. So it doesn't, I wouldn't say it impacts me like it would impact the average person, because I was like, TEDx said they weren't going to publish it. And I was like, good, don't publish it. It's going to get so much more. Oh yeah. It was like, just good. And so anytime there's anything negative that goes out, even my dad experiences the same thing, a negative article or something. People are so skeptical, I think, of mainstream media now, that when they say, oh, think this, people are like, yeah, okay, why? Why do you want me to think that? What's the truth there? I think, or I'm in a bubble, which is also possible.
And this is actually perfect. My next point was effectively that there are, within society, broadly speaking, I think that there are people generally willing. I think there's some ideologues on both sides, and there's a big chunk of society that is generally willing to go along. If it's staunch conservatism, they're staunch conservative. If it's progressivism, they're kind of just going with the tide, swimming with the stream, certainly not against it. And this goes within academia too. You raise questions, even your example talking about the diet and how it impacted you. They won't address your ideas. They'll say that's quack, or that's out there, or that's fringe. But there's this these folks within this sort of group, they're incredibly prone to trusting nice words from politicians and believing mainstream media. I think probably for you or I, or people within our circles, I, for one, and I think you like to engage in ideas you don't agree with. And then if there's a better idea than what you have, you'll likely move in that direction. So there are others who seem inclined to sort of ask questions, investigate outright things that don't align with their values. I know this is kind of a hard question, but what do you think, and I've got some proposals if it's tough to come up with something right away, what do you think is the predominant distinguishing factor between people who simply just go along and then people who are inclined to question. And I think, this is probably both of our experiences, many of the people I know who are inclined to question were sort of fringe or punk rock back in the 90s, 2000s, whatever. And then other people are mainstream, and those other mainstream people have flipped, and they're now sort of on the outskirts and now the new mainstream. And these punk rockers have become conservative. But what do you think it is that makes people question on it?
Okay, I actually do have an answer for this. So, and I probably got this from Dad, but there's a personality trait, agreeableness, which is pretty self-explanatory, but more agreeable people, generally speaking, women are more agreeable than men. But there's a variability in men and variability in women. But generally speaking, agreeable people will go with the flow because they don't like strife, right? So they don't like to correct somebody. If you're super agreeable, it makes you uncomfortable to correct somebody if they're wrong because you don't want to hurt their feelings. So a lot of it is based on not hurting feelings, right? That's why you would go with the flow. Whereas people who are less agreeable, it's like, oh no, you said something wrong. Can you clarify that? And they're not concerned about the feelings aspect at all. So I think what we're seeing is, and this is probably why there's so much dislike towards circles that we're in, is because a lot of the people in those circles are disagreeable. So if you say something, if I said something you didn't agree with, you might point it out, right? And if I have a podcast and someone says something I don't agree with, depending on the podcast, I'll say, can you clarify that? What exactly do you mean by that? And agreeable people don't do that. They're nicer. And so they're nicer, right, in one-on-one situations. But then if you have these outliers full of disagreeable people, then I would say the agreeable people are more likely to be like, those are the bad guys, get them. Which isn't exactly a nice thing to do, but it's still what people who are more agreeable do. So I think it comes down to agreeableness.
Which is very interesting because they're agreeable in the sort of innate personality sense. But I think agreeable people are also, and I know they're more subject to mob mentality because they're agreeable. So they'll go along with that sort of mobbing of people, whether it be truckers or the unvaccinated or whoever it is, they'll go after them. That's incredibly interesting. Something you brought up there that I think is incredibly interesting. You said women tend to be more agreeable. And this is sort of a pattern I've noticed myself, but there's this quote, I think it's Maya Angelou, that a woman's heart should be so lost in God that a man must find him in order to find her. But I think the same might be said of progressivism. Men seeking a partner in life are out there to impress and to find that significant other person. And if that other person is more agreeable and tends to go along with society, and being brash or disagreeable or strong in your opinions is not an attractive trait within society at that time, that can bring down the level of society. To quote someone else, I think it was Venerable Fulton Sheen, the caliber of women is effectively the measure of society. So if what is being promoted, ironically within feminism, it would seem traditional feminism, obviously maybe not, but modern feminism, there seems to be this mentality of agreeableness to the current status quo, to progressivism. And then men must sort of adhere to that level in order to be accepted within the agreeable circles. I don't know if you agree with that at all.
Partly. It's a tricky situation. So that's mainly what my dad says. And I've had like a bit of a disagreement. I don't fall into the category of agreeable women, obviously. But so I'd say like the average woman is more agreeable than the average man.
Oh no, yeah, for sure. And I don't mean to we don't token. Yeah. You just said generally there is a sort of
generally.
Of course.
But so I agree. I agree with what you said. Is what happened is, I think if we look back when women went into the workplace and got more involved outside of the home, basically, then society kind of moved towards being more agreeable. I think that kind of happened. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily women's fault, because that's kind of how we're built, right? So you go into the workplace and you're like, I want things to be nicer in here. This is pretty cutthroat. Like, you go into business, it's pretty cutthroat. Like, people are making off-color jokes. Like, it's kind of dog eat dog, and it's a competition the entire time. And I think women probably got introduced into that and were like, okay, this is kind of rough. Like, maybe we need some HR in here, because there's some off-color things. People's feelings are getting hurt, and that's not okay. And I think the mistake happened. I don't think that part was the mistake. Like, obviously, if women on average, go into a situation, they're going to want things to be a little nicer for people. I think what the problem was the people there initially should have just said no. So now we're in the situation where we have HR departments and society is supposed to be nice, which is not working out because you shouldn't operate a society on being nice. I don't know how to fix it at the moment, but I think the mistake happened when people just agreed with that. You know, when feminism came in, people were like, we want it, women were like, we want it this way. And they got support across the board. And then society changed and now we're here, and we're in a very tricky situation now. I don't know what to do about it though.
I think that there can certainly, obviously, and we're speaking in generalizations now. Very often on the sort of spectrums, there are women who exhibit more masculine traits and men who exhibit more feminine traits. So not to sort of blanket anything, but I think that there is certainly merit to that sort of feminine maternal instinct being implemented in certain management situations. We've seen businesses sort of benefit from some of that. But I think where things went wrong potentially was this being kind at the expense of being right. So doing something, this is what's happened within society at large, is we're willing to be wrong categorically and scientifically and with a degree of finality. We're willing to be wrong as long as it's nice. And that is, and we've talked about this the whole way, that is the sort of standard status quo of all of society. Well, is it nice? I mean, meat is generally considered aggressive. So you're not a particularly nice person because you're eating meat and it's red. And St. Thomas Aquinas said we shouldn't eat it on Fridays. But lots of these sort of things, any sort of conflict, any sort of contradiction in ideology is seen as a sort of aggression or an unkindness. I think what we've lost, though, is, I mean, kindness comes and goes. We talk a lot about tolerance. Tolerance is a horrible thing, because if I tell you that I tolerate you, how does that make you feel? I think we need to move towards loving each other. And obviously there's kindness and wisdom and compassion within all of that. But if you're doing something incredibly wrong, or you're going around living your life thinking 1 + 1 is 3, and I facilitate that, that means I don't care about you meaningfully in any way, shape, or form. To go back to my question before, if you don't mind, though, the juxtaposition between sort of agreeable people and then the undesirable people who dare ask questions. What would you say, or what do you think could possibly contribute? I mean, this is ultimately kind of a nature versus nurture question, but what do you think is the underlying difference between the types of people who simply go along and then the types of people who do ask questions? Is it confidence, humility, and willingness to be wrong? The environment you grow up in, wanting to learn from other people's opinions? What do you think it is that distinguishes those people?
I really believe it's not caring as much about feelings, right? Like you said something about being kind versus being right? And so it's people put feelings above being right. And sometimes, right? Sometimes you're in a situation where the amount wrong somebody isn't worth destroying them for, right? It's like, okay, let them think that. Sometimes you're in that situation where it's not worth a battle. But most of the time, if someone's wrong about something, then you could gently explain to them why they're wrong. And if they're like, oh, I can't hear this, it's like, okay, no, but this is good for you. You should at least hear it, even if you don't change your behavior. Like, listen, right? So I think the main difference is people prioritizing feelings over being right. It's like, no, feelings, your lived experience and your feelings is what matters most, when there is really an objective reality that at least should be heard.
Well, and I think it breaks down, we talk about everything, sort of the breakdown of the family leads to the breakdown of society broadly. And I think very often we're starting to see where it used to be a brother or a sister would set each other straight. Now those conversations can't even happen within the family, and everyone's letting everyone get along instead of actually caring for each other, instead of issuing that correction. But I do think one of the things that is vital and that is absolutely paramount is that because we've lost that idea of loving each other, because we don't know that we love each other on a fundamental level, when you start with that brashness or you start with that challenge, people put up their guard immediately. I've had very sort of difficult conversations with people very ideologically distant from me. But once the person realizes that even if they can hate you, once they realize that you actually care about them, and even if they don't agree with you, you're coming from a place of concern, that conversation can open up entirely. So I think maybe there's an intersection between loving people so they can let their guard down, but then not compromising so much that you're being kind instead of being loving.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's definitely a way to have a conversation where you can, yeah, love somebody, but disagree with them. And I think both people can also leave feeling okay about it. It's like, yeah, we don't agree, but it's fine. I think people are very hurt, especially after the last number of years of being like stuck indoors and just scared by the media and just terrified, at least periodically, right? People are stressed out and not well. So the fact that they're like, and then cancel culture is a thing. So I can kind of understand also why more liberal people won't talk to conservatives, because it's like, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to soundbite me, right? Are you going to have a friendly conversation with me and then destroy my reputation behind my back, right? And so there's this level of distrust. I think it's been exacerbated because people are hurt. And I don't know, I mean, hopefully inviting people on and doing podcasts with people that I disagree with, hopefully I'm contributing a little positively to that and not negatively. And hopefully you guys are doing the same.
Well, I certainly hope so. That's the hope. That's part of the reason I wanted to have you on. I really did want to talk about dialoguing, and I want to thank you for that important work that you're doing, bringing voices together, having debates, having conversations is sort of paramount to society. I hope more and more people check out your podcast. On that note, Michaela, thank you so much. Where can people find you? Where can people follow you?
So my podcast, if you want to watch it, it's on YouTube, and I do the style I like the best is opposing views. So I'll talk to one person who has a fairly extreme view on a contentious subject on one side, and then I'll talk to somebody on the other side and just have two conversations and then post them up. Those are really interesting. So I've been doing that for quite a while on like abortion and COVID and vaccines and contentious issues. And then I do regular interview style, like hour long. So that podcast is there. I'm on Instagram, Michaela Peterson. Podcast is on Spotify and Apple as well. So that's probably the best. If you're interested in diet, if you're having a hard time, you just want some free resources, I have a website called liondiet.com, and that has a blog and a whole bunch of, like a giant FAQ I wrote, and everything on there is free. There's a link to the Facebook group where a bunch of people are on the diet. And then there's my main website, mikhailapeterson.com.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you one more time for joining me. Very enlightening conversation. I very much appreciate it. Hopefully you'll come back on sometime. Thanks again. And for everyone out there for tuning in, I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for tuning in for Rebel News. I'm Adam Soos. Hey everyone, I really hope you enjoyed that conversation. And if you want to support the independent journalism that we do, if you want to support Rebel News and telling the other side of the story and represent the brand out there in the world to let people know that you are a rebel at heart, you can do so by going to rebelnewsstore.com and getting yourself some Rebel merchandise. If you use the code ADAM10 on your first order, you're actually going to get 10% off as well. So go to rebelnewsstore.com now.